After celebrating Silent Hill in last week's video, I think it's time for me to get back to doing some of my more regular videos and take a look at a new game for the PS2. It's still the season of Halloween though, so I'm taking a look at a lesser known horror game, Rule of Rose. I'd planned to review this game months ago, but the copy I got didn't work. I'd turn it on, a loading screen would pop up, and it would never go away, no matter how long I waited. Fortunately, I found a copy that actually does work. When it first came out, Rule of Rose had a rather mixed reception, and it's largely faded into obscurity, but it has gained a bit of a cult following over the years, so I'm going to see if this game has anything going for it. In Rule of Rose, you take control of a young woman called Jennifer. The setting is 1930s England, and she arrives at an orphanage in the countryside. However, when she gets there, she finds that the children are acting very strange, and rather creepy. After exploring the orphanage for a bit, she loses consciousness and wakes up inside an airship. The airship is full of children and is controlled by a group of young girls called the Red Crayon Aristocrats. While she is there, Jennifer must explore the airship and offer a gift to the aristocrats each month in order to appease them, and avoid potentially deadly consequences. As you might have already figured out, the story is very surreal and extremely weird. If it was supposed to be taken literally, then it would be incredibly stupid as well. But there are various clues and indications that make it clear that the airship, and the characters, objects, and events on the airship aren't meant to be taken at face value. For instance, there are several times where the airship is depicted as a flying fish swimming through the sky, and the layout of the airship is very suspect at times. There's a dreamlike quality to the world that's been filtered through the kinds of stories and fantasies that children come up with, which is a major theme of the game. When it comes to the little rituals and activities the children engage in, there's an innocence to it, but in many ways that makes it all the more creepy when the disturbing stuff begins. Throughout the game, various characters are bullied, tortured, and even murdered, all the while it's still presented as a childlike fantasy. It's unclear what's real and what's not real, and the blurring of that line makes the game very unique. As you're wandering through the airship or the orphanage, you're not alone, as there are a lot of children and a few adults in the area, but all of them act a bit off. Some of them ignore you, others are unkind to you, and even the ones that do try to be nice to you usually come off as very creepy. In some ways, the world the game creates is much scarier than a world in which you're all alone, and it's a grim reminder that children can be just as cruel as adults. I can safely say that I've never played a game like this one before, and the environment the game creates is a very unique and intriguing one. Unfortunately, the game does have problems. When it comes to the story, it's very surreal at first, but you do gradually uncover what's really going on bit by bit. There are some interesting reveals and turns the story takes, but the problem is that it's a little overly complicated, and because the game is so surreal and often presents events out of order, you sometimes have a hard time understanding what's going on. It's only after looking over the wiki that I mostly understood what was going on, but even then the story still feels a bit messy. For one thing, there are several plot twists that are supposed to be shocking, but they centered around characters that we didn't really see that much, and so they don't have the impact that they're supposed to. For another, without wishing to spoil, let's just say that there's a lot going on in the story, and it feels rather needlessly complicated, although I think a big part of that comes less from the story itself and more from how the story is presented. For a game that handled this better, let's take a look at Silent Hill 2. In many ways the story is very surreal and weird, but it's still grounded by some rules. The premise is that the main character, James Sunderland, receives a letter from his deceased wife, who died several years ago from a terminal illness. And upon receiving the letter, James goes to Silent Hill because he desperately wants to see her again. So while the game doesn't give you all the answers, you still have a basic grasp of what's going on, and the game can build on top of that premise, until it eventually leads to a phenomenal ending that I won't spoil. You should just play it yourself if you haven't. In contrast, Rule of Rose just dumps you into things without explaining anything. We don't know anything about Jennifer, why she came to the orphanage, or how she ended up on the airship. There's no basic rules or logic established, so the game's narrative and environment often just comes across as confusing rather than scary. And I can't really explain how the game could have fixed this without going into major spoilers. Let's just say that it would be like if in Silent Hill 2 we weren't told that James is in Silent Hill looking for his wife until you were more than halfway through. And yes, technically there are little hints and details about Jennifer's backstory from the very start of the game, but it's all things that would only make sense on a second playthrough. The overall story is pretty good, but the way it's presented is overly messy and confusing. But hey, I think the first Silent Hill story is messy and confusing, and I still love that game, because the atmosphere and gameplay is great. Rule of Rose has a good atmosphere, and the environment is very unique, but unfortunately the gameplay itself is bad. There's no way to sugarcoat it, it's just bad. The basic setup doesn't seem so bad at first. You're stuck on the airship, and during each section of the game you have to find an object to present as an offering to the Red Crayon Aristocrats to appease them. Doesn't sound too bad, right? Sadly, the process of finding these objects is typically not that engaging. Early in the game, you rescue a dog called Brown, and he plays an important role in the gameplay. When you find objects of importance, you can tell Brown to track their scent and find related objects, which you often need to do in order to progress through the game. So you usually make progress not by exploring or solving puzzles, but just by giving Brown an object to sniff and then just mindlessly following him. Sometimes finding the correct object requires a little thought on your part, but usually not. Also, Brown just isn't that interesting of a companion. He feels a bit like Huey from Haunting Ground if Huey had all the personality sucked out of him. And he also has the same problem as Huey did. In a horror game, you're supposed to feel scared and alone in a hostile environment, and that is severely undermined when you're given a loyal dog companion. But by far the worst aspect of the gameplay is the combat. Every so often these creepy imps pop up and you have to fight them off, and the combat mechanics are just terrible. The controls and hit detection is so janky that whether you'll successfully kill the monster is more a matter of luck than skill. Typically you'll end up either just running around and away from the imps, or you'll get dogpiled by a bunch and just have to mash buttons and hope for the best. And the imps, as well as the combat in general, feels rather out of place for the environment the game has created. Fighting off creepy monsters in Silent Hill works because the hellish haunted town environment the game created supports it. But in Rule of Rose, the creepiness came more from how unsettling and cruel the other children you encounter throughout the airship treat you and each other, and the imps and monsters that pop up every so often just feel out of place. Much like the story, in theory they could have worked, but the way in which the combat and the monsters are implemented just feels messy, and almost always comes off as more frustrating than scary. Between the annoying combat, tedious backtracking, and repetitive fetch quests, actually playing Rule of Rose ends up feeling either annoying or boring. Really, really boring. I can respect Rule of Rose for trying something different, and I can say that the environment, atmosphere, and story are pretty good, even if they do have their issues, but the gameplay isn't very good, and for me I don't think the narrative is strong enough to justify suffering through the boring gameplay. If you like horror games, I would recommend trying it out. There's a section fairly early in the game where you have to catch a rabbit. I would say play at least until the end of that section. If at that point you find yourself intrigued and invested in the game, you'll probably like it fine. But if by that point the game hasn't grabbed you, it probably never will. My final score for Rule of Rose is a 6 out of 10. I can see why some people like it, but I can also see why it got a rather lukewarm reception when it first came out. So what did you think? Have you played Rule of Rose? Whatever you think, be sure to let me know in the comments below. If you like what I do, feel free to subscribe and follow me on Twitter. This will probably be the last Halloween-related video I do this year, but it won't be the last video I do this year, so stay tuned for more. Thank you for watching, and I hope to see you in the next one.